Hello everyone, welcome back to Intellectual Combat Episode 2. I am Joe Archino, joined by Mike Doody, and this is a really special show we have today. The first one really got some nice feedback, so we want to thank everyone for taking the time to listen. But Mike, we've got another great guest lined up today. Why don't you tell us a little bit about who's joining us today?
So this is show number 2, and we are absolutely elated to have this show keep going on. Today we have a very special guest. Like I said from the beginning, this show is not going to be all about, politics or military. I want everyone on, and especially close friends of mine that have been so successful. Today we have the radio play-by-play announcer, Dan Duva, who was a great friend of mine from back in the day and a continuously great friend of mine. And Dan was nice enough to take the time today to, out of his very busy schedule, to sit down with us for a few minutes and just elaborate on, how he got where he is and the steps he took, and really how his career is going right now. So I'll do a little intro on Dan real fast, and then let's get him in. So Dan moved to Ridgewood in middle school from Nutley. He grew up in Nutley, New Jersey. And immediately we connected on a personal level. We became friends. We started playing baseball together, and we started hanging out, so on and so forth. And Dan, with another friend of ours, Guy Benson, essentially created sports broadcasting and news at Ridgewood High School. They had a really small section of the high school that was designated to this area. And when Dan and Guy came in, they took it over. I mean, this thing exploded. It went from every now and then they had something on RHS News that was broadcasted on local TV in localities, but really Dan and Guy took this over and it exploded, and they did everything. I remember football games, hockey games, they did gymnastics for the girls, they did baseball, you name it. Hockey was probably their biggest thing, and it's still on YouTube, and Dan's told me I have so many of these tapes that still could be released. And honestly, growing up with them, it's not often that you meet people like a Dan Duva that you can say, this kid's got it. Like, there's something about him. He was born he has this voice. He was born to do this, and he's destined for greatness. So Dan definitely embodied everything a professional sports broadcaster and now radio play-by-play announcer should embody. He had the poise, he had candor, he had a wealth of knowledge in sports, and the ability to see the flow of any game and then translate that flow into radio. And he just has the best radio voice I've ever heard.
Doing research for this, listening to his clips, I could have sat there all day just listening. It's just fantastic stuff.
Right, it's like mesmerizing. It draws you in. And that's why he's so intriguing and valuable to the NHL right now. And Dan had the honor also to announce baseball games in the Cape Cod League for a few summers, and this is where I believe he really started to get noticed. And I also had the honor of Dan inviting me up there to come and visit a few times, and like I said, we grew up playing baseball together, and that's been Dan's passion since I've known him, was baseball. And I'll let Dan, we're going to get into the questions with him, I'll let him elaborate more on his career leading up, but we reconnected when I was up at Fort Drum in upstate New York, and he was the Syracuse Crunch announcer for the AHL hockey team, but for the Tampa Bay Lightning up there. And he got me tickets to a few games and popped up to my house a couple of times, which was awesome to see him, such an established individual at such a young age. We were in our mid-20s at the time, mid to late 20s, and he was so established, and just to see that was great. And just to know, I would always tell him, Dan, there is no doubt in my mind that the NHL is going to call you up. It is only a matter of time. I remember my dad was actually visiting at that time too, and it was after Dan announced one of the high school football games. I think it was a state playoff game up there, and that's when his career really was taking off. But I've always told Dan, and I've always told anyone, that he was destined for greatness, and anything within this arena of sports broadcasting or radio play-by-play, I couldn't be prouder of who he's become today, and he's taken the time to come on the show. Without further ado, I want to introduce Dan Duva, the Vegas Golden Knights radio play-by-play announcer. Dan, how are you today?
Michael, Joe, I'm great now. After all that introduction, it's going to be a huge letdown after that.
I'm not so sure about that, so Dan, we're going to go right into the questions, but I do have to say, anybody who, in radio, you get a nickname, and sometimes it sticks, sometimes it doesn't. You've got a nickname that sticks, my friend, the Sicilian Soundbyte. That is one of the greatest radio nicknames I've ever heard. Can you tell us the link behind that connection?
Sure. Well, I guess it starts with having a Sicilian grandmother.
I'm sure that helps.
But, it was a few years ago in Syracuse. The Crunch were headed to the Calder Cup playoffs, and the team had acquired a goalie at the deadline, Mike McKenna, who's been a journeyman. He actually played a year or so in the minor leagues in Las Vegas when they had an ECHL team, the Las Vegas Wranglers. It's another story. But Mike had come in at the deadline, and he's just one of those talkative guys. You know, goalies are usually a little bit quirky, and Mike certainly fits that bill. In fact, he started his own podcast recently, and I was a guest on that not too long ago. And Mike, he's involved in a lot of things, and he wins burger competitions and goes on radio shows and all kinds of stuff. And so to mix and match food and broadcasting, Sicilian Soundbyte, I guess, worked out okay. And he started calling me that. I didn't even know. He was referring to me as the Sicilian Soundbyte in the locker room. He was not even 100% sure I was Sicilian. But Mike is just one of those great personalities. And as a matter of fact, I just saw his dad in St. Louis. Mike's grandfather is one of the founding fathers of hockey in St. Louis. The St. Louis Blues probably would not exist if not for Mike McKenna's grandfather. Mike's dad was involved in that and is still an off-ice official. And Mike, he's a few years older than me, but he's still playing pro hockey and bounced around a little bit this year. Went from the Senators to the Canucks for a day and ended up in the Flyers organization. But he's just a great guy and creative. And a good friend. That's where Sicilian Soundbite came from during the 2017 Calder Cup playoffs from goalie Mike McKenna.
That is a heck of a story, and I love how when those nicknames really come and there's a connection between another person with it, really well told. Well, obviously, like I said, doing a lot of research on you, it's really cool to be able to trace it back to your young days. So for you, from a 14-year-old broadcasting a high school hockey playoff game to broadcasting the Stanley Cup Finals for the Vegas Golden Knights, you're living the dream that so many sports fans grow up thinking about. How did that 14-year-old broadcaster develop into the voice of one of the most exciting young teams in professional sports?
I'm not sure, and when I figure it out, I'll let you know. If you say living the dream, and that's why I tell people not to pinch me, because it's possible I could wake up, and I don't want that to happen. It has been an incredible ride. I think that really it comes down to a few things, but the one that comes to mind over and over again is stubbornness. And that might not sound like the most admirable trait, but I think that's really what it is. When you have your mind set on something and you think that you're passionate about something, you don't give up. And frankly, giving up was never entertained. That means, for me, I never thought about doing anything else. I never seriously considered not doing this. Forget about seriously considered. I never have considered not doing this. So it just was a matter of doing what you love to do. And I remember having a chat with Jason Benetti, who's a very good friend of mine. He's now the Chicago White Sox TV broadcaster. He was a couple years ahead of me in school at Syracuse, and then we both ended up back in Syracuse when he was doing the AAA baseball team, the Chiefs, and I was doing the AHL hockey team, the Crunch. And we would have these conversations in the parking lot outside of the baseball stadium on a summer night, and neither one of us could find the strength to pull away from the conversation, get in our car and go home. So we would just chat under a lamppost, it seemed, for hours. Why we didn't go somewhere else, I'm still not sure. But frankly, I think that we both understood that even though we had some success at that point in our careers, there was more to do. But even though we had more to do, we just loved doing what we do, and that's call games. And even to the point where around that time, I guess, there was a high school lacrosse tournament there in upstate New York. And the local television network, Time Warner Cable Sports Channel at the time, was covering it. And their sports director was going to handle the play-by-play. But the producer needed sideline reporters and thought, well, hey, I've got to find somebody. Let's see if, our two play-by-play guys in the area, Dan and Jason, would be interested. And I suppose you might think that could be beneath a professional hockey announcer, beneath a professional baseball, and do the sideline reporting for high school lacrosse. But both of us separately jumped at the chance, and then we learned that we would be kind of tag teaming the whole event together, and sort of trading off. And it was a fun challenge. It was different, and frankly, we just loved doing it. And so whether it's Ridgewood Maroons varsity ice hockey in Ridgewood, New Jersey, or the Vegas Golden Knights in the Stanley Cup final, I know this is going to sound crazy, but one is just as meaningful to me as the other. It's just a love for the game and a love for broadcasting, and I'm fortunate to have been doing that since I guess it's 1999 was the first time I was ever on the air doing Ridgewood football, Ridgewood hockey in the fall of our freshman year of high school.
Well, Dan, that's kind of just the guy you are. You take the time. You don't find people with the kind of passion that you have for certain professions, and you take the time out of your day to cover a high school football game the same way you'd cover the Vegas Golden Knights. And that's really why you're such an intriguing person to have on. And I really can't wait for people to hear your story.
That's kind of you to say, Mike. And when you say that, that means a lot to me, because one of the great bits of advice that has been passed down through the generations of broadcasters comes from Marty Glickman and a lot of basketball fans and football fans in New York. And fans of a certain age will think of sports in New York from nobody else than Marty Glickman. He invented the word swish, first broadcaster for the Knicks, longtime voice of the New York Giants, the baseball recreations, responsible for the existence of HBO Sports. But Marty's credo to aspiring broadcasters was consider the listener, and not listeners, to speak to one person. It's one person, an intimate relationship between the broadcaster and the listener. And when you have that in mind, you're not just speaking from a mountaintop, orating down to the masses. In fact, it's a very close and personal relationship. It makes you more driven to provide an excellent broadcast and informative, entertaining, and I want that experience of a game to be enhanced by our broadcast. So with that in mind, regardless of the assignment, I always try to remember what Marty Glickman has offered to broadcasters, and that's another incredible story. I mean, he was part of the 1936 U.S. Olympic team that went to Berlin, but because he was Jewish, was not allowed to run, and that's a great story. Jesse Owens was one on that track team anyway, but Marty was just an incredibly accomplished broadcaster, and without Marty, you wouldn't have Marv Albert or Bob Costas, and of course, he set in motion the great legacy of sports broadcasting in Syracuse, too.
This is true, and that's a phenomenal story as well. But, I don't want to take too much time out of your busy day. We got a lot to cover.
Oh, I got plenty of time.
I know you do. But we got a lot to cover, so I want to move on. Joe, question number 2.
Well, you just mentioned Marty and kind of his advice. Well, there's another big person who obviously has played a big part in your career, and you grew up listening to the legendary play-by-play man Doc Emmerich. He obviously the voice of the New Jersey Devils. And there's a really good story about you and the time when you and a high school friend introduced yourselves to him and gave him your micro cassette recordings of your own broadcast for feedback. And Emmerich has actually developed into one of your great mentors over the years. Can you tell us a little bit about what it was like the first time you met the guy you spent your nights listening to, and what he has meant to your broadcasting career?
Oh, when you think about being a 14-year-old kid and in New Jersey, at that point it's 1999. The New Jersey Devils were just a few years removed from winning a Stanley Cup championship. As a little kid, the Rangers had beaten the Devils in the Eastern Conference Final, and it was just heart-wrenching. But then the Devils came back and won it the next year, and Mike Emmerich on the national TV broadcast, the championship to New Jersey. The Devils win the Stanley Cup. And not a better thing might have happened in my childhood. As a Mets fan, they were terrible. Generation K did not. Now, the Jets under then coach Pete Carroll and Rich Kotite, 3-13, 1-15. I had yet to develop an appreciation for college basketball. The Nets were terrible, but here were the Devils that actually brought respectability to the Garden State. So I love the Devils, and not only the team, but because the Devils broadcaster was also the voice of the sport on national TV, you really looked up to Doc. And frankly, spoiled in New York by a lot of broadcasters, not only in hockey, but football and baseball and basketball. I could go down the list. We'd be here all day of the great broadcasters in New York. But specifically in hockey, I mean, you had, Howie Rose broadcasting the Islanders games on TV. Sam Rosen doing the hockey games for the Rangers on TV. Marv Albert handed it off to his son Kenny Albert in the mid-'90s. And then over on the Devils side, you had Mike Miller on the radio and Doc Emmerich on TV. Those are just the play-by-play guys. I could continue with all the color commentators they had too. But Doc was clearly the guy. And as a Devils fan, and he is the national voice of the team, I mean, how fortunate we were. I probably didn't quite realize it at the time. Well, he's my announcer. He's going to broadcast all my games, as a Devils fan. But then you realize that he is who he is. But as a 14-year-old kid, there's very little difference between the star athlete and the star broadcaster. I have since realized there is a big difference. but at that point, it was just as cool for me to meet Mike Emmerich as it was for me to meet Scott Stevens. And I could not have been more in awe of shaking hands with Doc, but at the same time, not quite awestruck, just more appreciating the kind of way he carried himself. And so when we introduced ourselves to Mike Emmerich and Chico Resch at the Meadowlands, he could have just bristled or blown us off, or, he's got lots to do and a very accomplished broadcaster. And a lot of fans would have wanted to come and talk to him, but for whatever reason, he offered the same, thoughtfulness and kindness that he has to so many people for so long. And I've said this many times, but Mike Emmerich is a much better man than he is a broadcaster, and we know him to be among the very best sports broadcasters going right now. So he's just that kind of a good person, and I don't know. Maybe in his mind he was thinking, all right, I got stuff to do. Let me just say something nice to these kids and be on my way. But I don't think so. And over the years, you keep in touch. You say hi to him at games, and then as you're doing a little bit more, you give him a tape, and he'd get around to watching it. And, this is kind of before email existed. You had to talk to him or write a letter or something. So, but I do remember then a few years later, I'd sent him a hockey tape, and he sent me an email back, and I had been visiting a friend up in Maine. This is when I was in college, and I was just so excited to receive an email from Mike Emmerich with this lengthy feedback. I had to print it out. It was at my buddy's house up in Maine, and there was no extra paper for the printer, so we had to find some scrap paper, and we printed this letter from Mike Emmerich over the top of MapQuest directions, which had been printed out for my buddy's dad, and I still have the printout. And it was just so exciting, whether it was in high school or then in college, to kind of develop a relationship with someone of Mike's stature, and then to go along and we got to know each other better. And several episodes come to mind, but just I remember walking with Doc we were at Fordham University, and we were walking to the train there in the Bronx and trying to kind of direct him toward the Metro North stop. And I think that he thinks that conversation is one where I stood out because I must have asked some decent questions. It wasn't just about, hey, Doc, what can you do for me? It was more about hey, what do you feel about this? And we were sharing each other's thoughts about the business, about broadcasting, about hockey. And I say relationship because, I hear, a lot of, young people talk about networking and seeking jobs. It's all about networking. Well, I hear networking, I think of that little plug that goes into the back of your computer. Getting ahead in your career and in life is about relationships, not simply networking. And for Mike Emmerich to have the kindness to spend his time with me was really neat. And that cycles forward to helping me get a job with the Devils organization out of college, broadcasting in the ECHL for the Trenton Devils. Not too often your first full-time job out of school is in your home state when you're a sports broadcaster.
Yeah, it's incredible.
You expect to go to Podunk or somewhere.
Well, of course, especially in this business.
Yeah. And then, fast forward a couple of years, Doc was not advertising it, but I know that he helped put in a good word with the Syracuse Crunch American League team. And then even last couple of years ago, I know that he was in a position to offer support for me with the Golden Knights job. And then when the Stanley Cup Final came to Vegas, Doc had flown out the day before Media Day, landed on a Saturday night. Media Day was Sunday. The Golden Knights were to skate out of the practice facility, and the media wasn't going to attend that. But Doc wanted to see the facility. And so we met up, and we had breakfast together. And I'll never forget, we walked into one of my favorite coffee shops here where I often attend breakfast on game days. And Doc asked me if I wanted to sit with my back to the door because people might recognize me. I said, no, Doc, why don't you sit with your back to the door? And then we went over to the practice facility and introduced Doc to the owner of the Golden Knights, Bill Foley. And Doc was wearing his bowling green polo shirt because both general managers for both the Capitals and the Golden Knights had played at Bowling Green, and George McPhee, the Golden Knights GM, was there to say hi to Doc as well. So that was neat to kind of spend a little bit of time with Doc on the precipice of my first Stanley Cup final. But I also remember going into my first Calder Cup final back in 2013. Doc had always said, you got to listen to your first tape, hold on to it, and it'll remind you of where you've come. And so I did, going into my first Calder Cup Finals broadcast, and pulled out one of those old tapes. So it's hard to summarize everything that Doc has meant to me, but more than all of his lessons in broadcasting, he has reinforced what I have learned from my own family and my dad in particular about how to carry yourself. And those are the things that mean most to me from Doc.
Well, it's so awesome to hear that about that relationship, and you actually beat me to my next question, which was going to be about that quote, which is just so powerful. Always hang on to your first tape, and there's all of us. I think growing up, so many kids who want to be a young broadcaster. We always aspire. We look at that model person, and that's who we want to model ourselves after. And for you to kind of be able to develop a relationship like that with that guy who was kind of your go-to person, it's just really special. And that always hang on to your first tape thing, that's very, very powerful.
And it's funny because those tapes. I'm not quite a hoarder, though my mother would disagree. I think that there's something special about preserving each broadcast that I have done, and whether that's a demo tape into a micro cassette recorder, and I still have it, or many of those high school broadcasts. Mike, you mentioned gymnastics. We definitely did some of that. Soccer, football, lacrosse. And I wish I had broadcast more baseball, but, being on
you were on the team.
Harder to do. I think we tried to mic me up for a game. I'm not sure if that
we
worked.
did, and we also did one. I think it was at, what's that minor league stadium at Montclair State?
Montclair State.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Yogi Berra
Stadium. We did one there. I remember it distinctly, you and Guy.
That's right. One time, though, we got in trouble. We were broadcasting a high school football game, and we had duct taped a mini camera onto Doug Canetta's cap. Doug Canetta's son was Mike, and we on the football team,
right?
Player on the team.
Played football.
And Mr. Canetta was working the chain crew. And so we figured this would be a great spot if we taped a camera to his cap.
That was
hilarious. We'd have a great view of where the referee would mark the ball, and we were beating the what out of, I think it was the Eastside Mighty Ghosts, and then the coach complained, and at halftime they got word up to us that they had to get rid of the camera because
we were pulling the Patriots. Yeah,
Ridgewood was stealing signs.
It was like 41-0 at halftime.
Yeah, exactly. So which was just silly. And then there was a story in the Bergen Record a few days later. Courtesy can prevent hard feelings, and Ridgewood head coach Chuck Johnson defended us, and he described us as Pat Summerall and John Madden. Once he gave us that, that was probably the nicest thing Chuck Johnson ever said about us publicly. He was very supportive, but for him to defend us in that way was really neat. But it just goes to show there's so much history in any one broadcast. It kind of captures a moment in time. And like I said, doing a Devils Senators game with a micro cassette tape, fast forward, I not only had listened it to myself a couple of times in preparing for a big game in my professional broadcasting, but I would occasionally play it for my students when I teach play-by-play class at Syracuse University, And a lot of the students had experience, but a lot of students didn't. They were taking the class hoping to jumpstart a path into play-by-play, or at least an experience, and concerned that they wouldn't be able to get into this. And then I'd play this tape, and then they'd hear how awful I was as a 14-year-old kid attempting to broadcast hockey. And, well, if you start there and it's this bad, well, Dan's doing this professionally, so maybe I could do that too. It's not like, you have to be Leonardo da Vinci to master the art of play-by-play. I think that for people who take the time to invest in this craft, and it is a craft, it is kind of an art, there's also some science to it. And I think that's why I enjoy it so much. It does blend together so many attributes of the human condition. But I share that tape with kids from my earliest days in hockey broadcasting, and I'll listen to myself occasionally. But then, those hockey broadcasts from high school, there were some great moments. Ridgewood had reached the state semifinal that year, and there's some great games along the way. And then just to see how the broadcast evolved over the years, how we as people, the students, Guy Benson, my broadcast partner, and the players, how we grew up over the course of 4 years. My goodness, 4 years in high school. I loved high school, as you know, Mike. We had a great time in high school, and it just 4 years seemed like so much more than 4 years looking back upon it. Now 4 years is kind of like a blink. I guess that's what happens as you get a little bit older. But boy, those 4 years, I knew how great it was while I was living it, and tried to soak it all in and take advantage of that time, because there was so much excitement around what we were doing. We felt that we had to deliver. The reason, by the way, and I don't know if I've said this before, but the reason why we went to Devils games with a micro cassette recorder to make practice tapes is because we had done Ridgewood football games and just started to get some traction with the families, the supporters of the Ridgewood football team. But we both loved hockey, Guy Benson and me. And we wanted to prove to the Ridgewood Ice Hockey Foundation that we were good enough to broadcast their games. Wow. So, to show off how talented we were, we would go to Devils games, practice, and then we were going to play those tapes for the head coach, Jeff Nias, who also was a teacher at Ridgewood High School. That was the origin of making those practice tapes, to show to the Ridgewood hockey people that we should be accepted. We would be good enough. They should allow us to do their games. And they're we could realize quite the opposite for them. They were like, "Oh, would you please do our games? Would you please do our games?" We could have been terrible. We could have been speaking in Spanish. I think they still would have taken us, because they wanted the coverage of the team and obviously the attention. That the team was in its third year, I believe, at the time. So anyway, that's
we were young at the time.
Came about, yeah. And Mike, you were part of that. The Ridgewood Ice Hockey Foundation. All the parents. That group of people. And, there's other sports have great, foundations and associations and everything, but there was something special about that hockey group, because those folks had really gotten hockey started in Ridgewood, and there was just so much fun around all the activities, the paintball trips, and we could go on and on just about Ridgewood hockey. But that's and I kind of forgotten about. That's why we originally had done some of those demo tapes to get us ready for the first season of Ridgewood ice hockey on RHS TV in '99, 2000.
Well, I mean, listen, 4 years may have went in a blink, or it may have felt like an eternity to you back in the day, but it sure is a blink now. And 40, 50, 60 years from now, your name, as well as Guy, are still going to be talked about in Ridgewood High School. I mean, you guys definitely were the catalyst to what the program has come to today, which leads us into our last question for you. I mean, we actually had 6 questions. You have hit 3 of them without us even asking you. That's how just intellectually sound you are at this point. But really,
I'll come up with more questions.
Yeah, I got to have a list of 20. But all the young broadcasters out there, or aspiring broadcasters, who have dreams just like you, and they want to turn that dream into a reality, I'm going to say 2. Let's give you 2 pieces of advice that you can give to these kids out there. Now, I know your journey, when you look at your bio, you could fill up an entire textbook. It looks really elaborate and long, but I know that you almost fast-tracked everything. I mean, at 34 years old, you've accomplished so much that these kids that are 14, 15 now are like, this is incredible. How could I possibly take this journey and get to where he is? But what are the 2 pieces of advice that you would give kids like that?
I think that the first thing that comes to mind, Mike, is be kind. And that manifests in a few ways. If you're kind to the people who have helped you, I think that you're doing only the best a human being can do in thanking somebody. People like Mike Emmerich, Ian Eagle, many others. It's just neat to have, Mike Tirico, among the most prominent sports broadcasters, football, basketball, the Olympics now. He recently did his first couple of hockey games, and among the people he reached out to for advice was me.
Wow.
That's crazy. I remember meeting Mike on a street corner in Syracuse when I was walking out of the student radio station, WAER. It's like the Springsteen song. I was walking in, he was walking out, and that was the beginning of a friendship there. And so he sent me such a kind note when I got the Golden Knights job, and then, to see him during the Stanley Cup Final, he was covering as a host for NBC. And then, we saw each other at the All-Star game this year, and, he said, I'm going to be doing some games. What advice do you have? And then Richard Deitch from The Athletic wrote a story. It was supposed to be about Mike Tirico doing his first hockey games. It ended up being almost as much about how I prepare for the games and what information and advice I shared with Mike Tirico. So you try to give back as much as you can to those people, I mentioned Mike Tirico, but Mike Emmerich, Ian Eagle, and I could go down the list of a lot of people, not just prominent broadcasters, but plenty of other people too. And that means that you can't thank those people as much as you really would like to. You can say thank you a million times, it's not enough. But the thing that you can do is pay it forward. So when I say be kind, it's be kind to those people who helped you, but also be kind to those people who are coming in your footsteps. And you mentioned earlier the Cape Cod Baseball League. I enjoy that experience as much as anything. And they say once you get sand in your shoes on Cape Cod, you'll always go back. And that's true for me, even as a, devout Jersey Shore guy. But Cape Cod has become a special place because Guy Benson and I, after our high school career was wrapping up, we had plotted a course to broadcast Cape Cod Baseball League games, and thinking that if the best college broadcasters could cover the best college baseball players, that would be appropriate. That's where the best college baseball players were going. So we did there what we kind of did in high school, which was create a program, and we broadcast the games there for a while. The thinking was, for Guy was going to go to Northwestern, I was going to go to Syracuse. How would the two of us continue working together? That's what we wanted to do. Baseball was really our first love as a sport, and here was a chance to do it. And so we did the games together for 4 years. But since then, I've been sort of a broadcast coach, consultant, advisor, whatever you want to call it. So we get over 150 applicants for 2 play-by-play positions for the Chatham A's, and I select and then coach those student broadcasters. And we've been doing it for quite a while now. And we've got writers and photographers and video folks and Chatham A's media team. So that's one way for me to give back. And you mentioned earlier teaching at the Newhouse School at Syracuse, trying to give back to those students there. Interns that I've had, whether it was with the Trenton Devils or the Syracuse Crunch, and on and on and on and on. And I try as often as I can to help those aspiring broadcasters who reach out to me. And just a matter of fact, last week I got an email from a 13-year-old in Massachusetts applying for a Chatham A's play-by-play job. Asking, how old do I have to be to apply for this position? I know I'm probably not ready yet as a 13-year-old since this is college sports, but how old should I be? And and this student didn't know that he was writing to me, an NHL broadcaster. So I replied, and I told him a brief version of how we got started. And I pulled out a quote that Ian Eagle had sent to me when I was about that age, and essentially said, you'll get out of it what you put into it. It'll make what you put into it will make your experience worthwhile. So I try to share that bit of advice. So again, number one was be kind. That's the long story behind be kind. But the other thing is I think I described it earlier as stubbornness. You might call it affectionately passionate you want to call it determination or commitment, in that world of things, you cannot give up in the pursuit of what is your ambition. I'll never forget George Neville, the principal of our middle school in Ridgewood, New Jersey, Mike. George was the teacher for the journalism class, and the first class in that January of 1999 when we were in 8th grade. Mr. Neville asked us to go around the room, introduce ourselves, and say, "What gives you pizzazz? What's your ambition in life?" And I said I wanted to be a sports broadcaster. And it came around to Guy Benson, who was in the class, and he said, I want to do that too. And thus began the Dan and Guy empire. But that always stuck with me. And then my freshman year at Syracuse, I remember David McCullough came to speak. David McCullough, as many of your listeners will know, just a tremendous author, one of my very favorites. And he had recently published his biography about John Adams.
Fantastic book.
Yeah, it's just as much about Abigail Adams as it is about John. But David offered a remembrance of Ralph Waldo Emerson, who in John Adams' dying year, of course, we all remember that John Adams and Thomas Jefferson died on the 4th of July, 1826, 50 years to the day of the Declaration of Independence. And this was in that final year of John Adams' life. Ralph Waldo Emerson, a recent Harvard grad, came to offer his respect to President there in Quincy, and recorded the conversation afterwards and wrote down one key passage that David McCullough then shared with us students when we were freshmen at Syracuse. And David, quoting Ralph Waldo Emerson, quoting John Adams, said, "I would to God there were more ambition in the country. That is, ambition of the laudable kind, the ambition to excel." And so I have had that quote in my mind for a long time. And so when at the beginning of each school year at Syracuse University, the faculty is introduced to the incoming freshmen, we're each asked to, as George Neville once asked, introduce yourself and offer what gives you pizzazz, something for the new students to remember us. And I think back to what George Neville had asked that question to me when I was 14 years old. And then what David McCullough had said in that same room at Syracuse University, "I would to God there were more ambition in the country, that is, ambition of the laudable kind, the ambition to excel." And so I offer that to the students and ask, how will you discover your ambition to excel? And it's ambition for excellence, not ambition for glory or money or fame. It is excellence that you're after. I find that so often in this business of broadcasting, whether it's in sports or elsewhere, it's all about me. I this, I know this person, I know that. That's not what we're about. We are reporters, we're storytellers, we're a conduit for the participants and the consumers, and we hope to enhance a story by the way we tell it, but we are not necessarily part of it. And I think that when I share that bit of advice, I call it the stubbornness about what I do is a big part of it, but the ambition to excel. I'm stubborn about the ambition to excel, not all the other stuff. And if you're good at what you do, perhaps some of those things come along, which is okay, but those are not the goal. That's not the objective. It's about the ambition to excel. So be kind and find your ambition to excel. I think I've narrowed it down to those two things.
That is just fantastic. I mean, not only are you as well-spoken as anybody else, I mean, you know your history behind everything else, too. That just blew me away. And I think for anybody, and for me, I'm still kind of young in my broadcasting career, but that is definitely some words that I will never forget. That was just terrific, Dan. Thank you so much for your time today.
Dan, it's been an honor, man. And that was the most in-depth answer to such a simplistic question that I've ever heard in my entire life. But thank you very much, man.
You're welcome.
It's greatly appreciated.
You have to pay tuition.
I hope not.
Dan, we wish you the best of luck the rest of the season, and hopefully when things settle down again, we'll be able to grab you again, because that was just fantastic, and I think everyone's in for a treat who's going to be able to listen to this today.
Oh, Oh, it's my pleasure, guys. Thank you so much. And please keep up the great work that you're doing. And I wish you guys all the very best.
Thank you, and same to you, Dan. All the best to you.
Thanks, buddy.
We thank Dan once again for coming on and giving us just such good content. I mean, Mike, you and I, we've been talking about it. He gave us meaning behind every single word, and I was just blown away. That's one of the most memorable interviews I've ever done.
And that's how I remember Dan since we were little kids. I believe he came to Ridgeview when he was maybe before 13 or 14, but right around that time. And I remember him always just being so elaborate with everything. He paid attention to detail. He had the ability to operate autonomously when he was a kid at a young age. And this is really what has excelled him in my eyes as well as his drive and passion throughout his entire career. But the way he answered the questions, and it was hysterical. We have 6 questions on a piece of paper that, Joe, you really did the research on Dan. I know him from a young age. I caught up with him again at Fort Drum. He invited me to his Cape Cod League baseball games. I went up there. We've hung out a ton. At Fort Drum, I saw him a few times. And so I understand the pathway he took getting to where he is now. But for you doing the research and coming up with these questions, I mean, we would ask him one question. He would answer 3 of them without us even having to ask it. So he's definitely very intellectually sound, like I told him on the podcast, and we're honored. And I look forward to having more people on like this. We're actually having his, I don't know how you want to word it, co-conspirator. We're having his co-host. His
co-host.
From
his partner in crime.
Guy Benson on next week, fingers crossed.
It's a logical way to follow it up, right? The Ridgewood High School connection.
You have to. I'm going to work the pipeline. But those two are obviously huge names in their respected industries now. And this is what we're aiming to do. I don't want to make this all about, the military or politics. We got to be well-versed, and podcasts need that, and people want to hear this stuff. So, yeah, Dan, thanks again for coming on, and Joe, thank you for taking the time to really research him and come up with these questions.
You made this interview happen, and I know with his busy schedule, that certainly wasn't easy. I mean, he told us right before we even started how he just basically was just getting over doing work last night in a game. He's getting ready for another one and more interviews, so it's just, I mean, I think we all can imagine how rigorous it is to be a broadcaster, going all the time, getting ready for these games, and he gave us his time today, and I don't know how much sleep he got last night, but he sounded like he could just do a game right off the top of his head like that, but
he's
fantastic.
Incredible. And that's how it comes on, but that's how driven someone like that is, to be on the road. Imagine when you're a kid, you're always like, I got practice at 4, I have to travel to, the local town, next town over to play, and times that by 1,000 and maybe even more so, and then add having to do research on top of it and having to gather stats and do analysis on that. And it just shows you how someone like this has extreme candor, poise, tact within the field. It's very impressive.
And it's like you said, you get out of it what you put into it, and it's certainly for him, he's put a lot into it, and it's all paying off for him big time now. He deserves everything he has. And once again, big thank you to Dan Doody for coming on. Mike, you made the interview happen. This podcast, really excited with the way things are going with it. We want to thank the listeners again for all the support you gave us with episode 1, and we really hope that you enjoy episode 2. But that's going to do it for this episode of Intellectual Combat. I'm Joe Archino.
And I'm Mike Doody.
We'll catch you next time.